It is great to be back here. I was thinking it's 20 years ago, I was on stage at S4. It has changed a lot. There was probably 24 of us in the room. And it is so exciting to see how this has grown and changed and how much progress we're making. The other thing, though, that's interesting is that it's been over a decade since I've become really concerned about supply chain attacks. Back in 2014, I became aware of the Dragonfly attacks. Dragonfly attacks were probably run by a Russian intelligence agency, maybe GRU, going after getting software malware onto the plant floors of pharmaceutical and energy companies in Europe. And at the time, I was promoting the Tofino firewall and working on and doing research on firewalls. And what really struck me at the time was that my little firewall wasn't going to help against this new and rather scary form of attack on OT. So I left the firewall business. The next year, I worked with Billy Rios, Jonathan Butts, and Doug Maw at DHS, and we started looking into what could we do about supply chain attacks against OT. Out of that, for the last decade, I've really been focused on that. And a lot has happened in the last decade. Particularly exciting is the development of the software bill of materials and the excellent work by people like Dr. Alan Friedman, Josh Corman, J.C. Hertz. There's too many people to name, that we now have a way of communicating supply chain information up and down the supply chain. Is a phenomenal development in a decade. Great news. But I'm not going to talk about software bill of materials today, as important as they are. I want to talk about something more basic and something, to me, much more critical. And that's defining even what a supply chain attack is. And the reason is that as I've looked at supply chain attacks and looked at documentations on standards, I get really, really frustrated what I see as very narrow definitions. Let me give you a very specific example. If you read the CISA definition of a supply chain attack, it says it is when a threat actor penetrates the network of a software supplier and injects malicious code. Now that makes tons of sense when you're talking about SolarWinds. It makes no sense when you're talking about something like the Wizvera attacks that the North Koreans ran, or when you're seeing attacks against an open source project. There's no network involved. So does that make it not a supply chain attack? No. So I see this over and over. In fact, I've seen academic papers and industry papers. There was a paper from ESA a little while ago that ruled out a whole bunch of supply chain attacks because they didn't fit into the CISA definition. Okay, so to me, this was a real mistake. We need a definition, and I wanted to come up with a definition that was inclusive of all the different attacks that I see actively out there. Now, to do that, rather than just writing a line and leaving it, I thought the way to do this is define a taxonomy. So what's a taxonomy? You all know what a taxonomy, the framework, the old version of the framework says it's a schema classification. I think that's a good definition. And an effective taxonomy, if we can build one, really should do three things. First of all, it should group the different types of attack and classify them according to their characteristics. This is important so that we can communicate between ourselves on what a supply chain attack is and what type of attack it is, and then use that to facilitate our defenses, to describe our controls. Now, the important thing to me is it needs to be meaningful. It's easy to get dumb classifications. What do Attila the Hun and Winnie the Pooh have in common? Any guesses? Same middle name. So it's true, we can classify on middle name. That does not mean it's a meaningful classification. And this is exactly what I started to be concerned about, is that there were definitions and taxonomies out there that were starting to define those attacks based on things that were not meaningful. Now, there's lots of taxonomies. Here's some pretty good ones. I went through over a dozen different papers and articles and standards that either alluded to a taxonomy or laid out a taxonomy. For example, MITRE has an implied taxonomy in the attack framework where they say supply chain attack, and they break it down into three categories. Attacks that compromise dependencies, attacks that compromise software, and attacks that compromise hardware. I don't think that is either deep enough, and I also think it's too narrow, and I'm really fuzzy about the difference between the dependencies versus the software. So the MITRE attack, while useful, didn't do it for me. On the other hand, the second reference there, Taxonomy of Attacks on Open Source Software Supply Chains by Landissa and gang, is outstanding. Really, really good paper. They define 107 different forms of supply chain attack and build out a very detailed taxonomy. My concern with it, though, is it's against one part of the supply chain, the open source developer. And that was the second thing, and I'll use this, in fact, I'll use all of these. I've taken all of these. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. I wanted to be able to take the best of every one of those, and Landissa is one that I used over and over when I wanted to dig into open source attacks. Now, the second thing about a taxonomy is it needs to be applicable to the participants in the supply chain. And the supply chain, of course, has lots of participants. It's the whole range from originators of software right to the asset owner who's going to be using the software. And when I map the different defined taxonomies or implied taxonomies, they all tend to pile into the developer, dumping all the responsibility on supply chain defenses on the developer. And I think that's a mistake. As we'll see as I define our taxonomy today, that there are real responsibilities for the asset owner when it comes to supply chain defense. So I've struggled with getting this started, and the hardest part of this, whoops, that's not what we wanted. That build didn't work very good. Okay, all right. So the hardest part of any journey is the first step. What do you guys, yeah, that looks like that to me too. Can I get it to work? Nope. Okay, so what I wanted to show you there is there's many, many, many different ways to break down your initial categories. And my apologies on what it's looking like there. We could start out with the definition that MITRE supplied, which is compromise dependencies, compromise software, compromise hardware. I don't think, as I said, is a good way to divide it. Another way of breaking it down was where does the code execute? And we could start off dividing it attacks against code that executes on hardware, attacks the codes that executes on firmware and software. Again, that seemed artificial to me. I went through, as you can see, quite a few different ways of starting this off, and I eventually threw up my hands and said, I got to go back to basics. Okay, so what do we got here? Oh, cool, now it's doing something different. All right, you can see, nope, it's still doing something weird. Hey, all right. I'm going to skip that part. Bottom line is I really struggled for how we go about defining that top layer category in a meaningful manner. So I went back to what's a supply chain. No point going back and looking at what's a supply chain attack, because the definitions are all over the map. What's a supply chain? And I looked through many, many definitions, and here's 3 of many. And one thing I noticed with every definition is this. They're always dividing the supply chain into 2 phases, creation and delivery, or you can call it production and distribution, or production and delivery. You look through hundreds of definitions, you'll find this. So I thought, you know, that's probably the way we should define the attacks. Are the attacks focused against the distribution of software, or are they focused on the creation of software? Or, a lot of ways you can say this, is the attack objective delivery of malware, or is it the creation of malware within a system, within a software creation system? Case in point is Stuxnet. Stuxnet software was probably written in some lab somewhere. The attacks on the supply chain that the Stuxnet did was stealing of code signing keys to facilitate distribution. Take On the other hand, SolarWinds, as a case in point, the attack was to get into a software manufacturing system and then let that distribution system run as it normally would. Okay. So we can say this a number of different ways: attack the software delivery system versus attack the software creation system. And I started to think about this, and then I found a very interesting paper by John Miller at MITRE. It's a very old paper, over a decade old, called Supply Chain Attack Frameworks and Attack Patterns. And he defines his taxonomy exactly in the same way. And I think it's a very insightful paper. So I decided this is the way where I was going to go. So again, in my proposal is I believe this is how we should start off. And let's go down those pathways. Let's start with distribution-focused attacks. Again, I want to stress this is a proposal. This is not written in stone. So I'm here to listen for feedback and say, no, no, you got that leg wrong. It should be over here. But what I tried to do is collect every single attack that could be considered a supply chain attack and see if I could put it into the taxonomy in a way that we could define a common defense of the other attacks in that same leg of the chain. So could we organize this in a way that we could systemically define defenses against a class of attacks and responsibility against class of attacks? Anyway, let's go walking down this, and I'll give you the examples of attacks. Of course, I'm not going to list every single supply chain attack in the universe that's been known, but I'm going to give you examples. So let's talk about explaining commercial distribution systems. And I broke that down by how software is distributed today from commercially distributed. And obviously, the number one way is distributed through some sort of web distribution system, and that's exactly what we saw with Dragonfly. Of course, over-the-air updates are very popular too, and we've seen attacks against that. The ASUS attacks back in 2019, great example of attacking an over-the-air update system. I suspect I could go deeper than that. There's probably other distribution mechanisms. I'm happy to, if people want to add some legs to that, you know, mailing CDs or something like that, right? CDs, fortunately, are kind of dead. The open source world is a little different. Distribution of software in the open source works slightly differently. And so for this, I turned to the Landisa paper because they'd done such a good job, and they defined two forms of distribution attacks. One, create a malicious package and put it into a project. So a great example were the colors lib that somebody called Lollipop started putting into the Python package index. And they also describe namespace confusion as another way of exploiting the open source distribution. They actually keep going. There's tons and tons of levels down. If you want to read the paper, you can go into a lot of taxonomy. And I think we might as well borrow their taxonomy when we're talking open source. Next, exploit the code signing infrastructure. Again, the absolute perfect case is Stuxnet. Let's go steal some code signing keys and use that to facilitate the spreading of my malware. Okay, but there's other ways of doing that, and Byres is a very good example. South Korea being attacked through North Korea buying and setting up fake companies in North America so they can get illegitimate code signing certificates issued that look like South Korean companies. And then lastly, you see the attacks that are just exploiting the flaws in the code signing infrastructure. The 3CX attacks of about a year and a half ago, great example of explaining the holes in the authentic code signing mechanisms. I suspect, again, we probably could add a few more legs here, but I don't have time today, and I'm open to hearing that from any of you. Lastly, I wanted to talk about an attack that I believe should be considered a supply chain attack. I call it software counterfeiting or software masquerading. Distributing your code, pretending to be something else as you are, distributing your malware. And you guys are, I'm sure, very, very aware that there's lots of websites out there dedicated to distributing cracked software. And of course, this is true in our space. There's OT software cracking sites. This is one that Ron Brash showed me, a Romanian license cracking forum. And guess what? It's got lots of HMI software up there. What we found that was fascinating about this site was that there was packages showing up there named with metadata that looked like legitimate OT software containing this particular piece of malware. And we were seeing this malware being widely distributed according to VT across Eastern Europe late last year, about 1,000 hits of this malware showing up. So this is an interesting distribution channel. It's using cracking forums as a way of distributing your malware. And I think that is a form of supply chain as well. Why do I include this particularly? It's because I think this is a great example of where the supply chain responsibilities don't really fall to the poor software developer anymore. It's really the responsibility of the system integrator and the asset owner to say, are we using legitimate software? Yes or no? So unlike most of the suggestions and the guidance for supply chain attacks that focus on the developer and what they must do, I think this is pointing out that there's responsibilities all along the chain. So let's move on to the other leg, the creation-focused attacks, attacking software creation systems. One of the legs is exploiting existing issues. I actually struggled on where to place this, and this is something like Log4j. You don't have to write new malicious code, it's already out there. You can just exploit existing bad code. And of course, we see attackers like Iran's national threat actors using this. We also see exploits against configurations, and a good example is forgot the name. But anyway, the attacks that we saw a few years ago, the DDoS attacks, I keep on thinking Miata, but that's a car. Where we saw people exploiting, or the attackers exploiting the default passwords in Sierra Wireless cellular modems. And again, I'll break these out separately because the controls for these are different. You control the use of default passwords differently than you control the management of vulnerabilities. Of course, you can have the attackers exploiting software or software development. We can subvert a commercial system. SolarWinds is my classic case. And we can dig down very, very deep. For today's talk, I'm not going to dig down deep, but you can clearly see, you can have somebody contributing malicious source code by getting into a system, injecting during the build, just forcing the use of malicious or out-of-date vulnerable versions. On the open source, again, I deferred to the excellent work by Landissa and his fellow writers, and they go very deep, miles deep. And I won't dig into that, but you can look at the slides later. Next, I wanted to talk about exploit hardware. I struggled where exactly to put this, and I really struggled with this one for a very, very good reason. Every one of the other supply chain attacks, there are known examples. We've seen them happen. But when you go to look for proven examples of supply chain attacks using hardware, you really only hit up against rumors. If you go, for example, look at MITRE, and you look at their attack framework, they give examples of every attack except for exploit hardware. There's no examples. Now, people can point to Huawei and introducing backdoor hardware, but it is yet to be proven as far as I know. And that's what I saw every time I looked at something. I could not find the proof that that type of attack. So everything I say on this leg is supposition and is open for debate. I'm going to be more talking about potential risk rather than proven threats. I want to start off even getting rid of the Huawei example, talk about another one called Phison. And Phison, I want to look at this. We started looking at this particular vendor because Ron Brash and I were looking at the components on a number of interesting firewalls. And we started to work with an excellent company, Exenger, who's a partner of ours, who could take the information we could find and then give us an understanding of who had produced it, what's their reputation. And Phison, again, is only an example, but what Exenger was able to do that was really great is tell me this, that the executive had been suspected of fraud and forgery. Actually, they got convicted of fraud and forgery. Does this mean I shouldn't use the FISON? No. By the way, if you're not familiar with them, they're in just about everything. They're a provider of controllers for NAND memory. They're just about in everything. So we can't say I'm not buying from them, but I want to be aware of them because if you've got your executive team going to jail, it's definitely an executive team that could be subject to pressure from say, a foreign nation state. So, again, I want to be 100% clear. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying that the actions of their executive have made them a little risky. And again, I want to also thank Exenger for giving me tons and tons of data about different suppliers and what their risk profiles are. Okay, so let's move on. Another possibility is producing counterfeit hardware. Again, I could not find an example in the actual cyber realm of producing counterfeit hardware. We've had our counterfeit hardware in the OT world, for example, the Yokogawa pressure transmitters, but I don't think it's a cyber attack. I think it was somebody wanting to sell junk transmitters at premium prices. Not an attack that was driven around trying to penetrate a system. But it's not hard to imagine this attack. You know, I make a firewall, I make a Tofino, something that looks like a Tofino. It's all painted the right colors, and I sell it for half price, but I've added a little extra software in there. So it's not hard to see that there is a risk from counterfeit hardware. I wasn't sure if this leg should live here or whether it should live back over on that masquerading leg. It's to be determined. Very last one I want to talk about is exploiting features built into hardware to be able to do things, to be able to load other hardware that is restricted. How many people attended the excellent talk yesterday on the Danish, the attacks on the Danish electrical system? That was a great talk and a scary talk. If you didn't attend it, the center of the attack was this little firewall called a Zywall. And the attackers were in two stages attacking that firewall, vulnerabilities in that firewall, and exploiting those vulnerabilities in order to be able to penetrate Danish electrical infrastructure operator systems. So Ron Brash and I started to look at the Zywall to see what we could find in there. Same thing, we're always interested in what's inside a box. And the first thing that we found that really surprised us was a bunch of Huawei scripts. Now, the Zywall is approved on the GSA schedule for use in the United States, yet Huawei is a restricted entity. So there's a little bit of a disconnect that had me doing some head scratching there. Now, who actually wrote those scripts? I don't know. This is something I'll probably ask Exenger to figure out who actually wrote the scripts. Was it Huawei who wrote those scripts? Was it an open source project? Why are they there? But they're there. But the second thing that we started to realize and why this is is there was a whole bunch of information about how you could take Huawei modems, cellular modems, and plug them into Zywalls and have them boot up. So here's a way that you could accidentally or maliciously introduce restricted hardware into a controlled, a sanctioned area. Now, obviously, you're going to be watching for your USB keys. There's lots of controls here the asset owner can do to mitigate this, but it is a threat. The ability for an attacker to basically incent or somehow get around controls because of this ability to side-load hardware. Okay, so that's my taxonomy broken out at a high level. And again, I want to be clear that the whole intent here is to provide a starting point, a taxonomy that includes everything in the supply chain and everyone in the supply chain. Not just the software producer, but the software user as well. Now, what do we do with this? Well, that's another whole afternoon of talks. One of the things that I would love to do is we can settle on this if we agree or somebody can take and run with this, is we can start talking about what mitigations and controls we do to deal with every one of these attack nodes on the taxonomy. How do we deal with them? But the first thing is who's responsible? And so I started working on a RISI chart. And I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with RISI charts. It shows who's responsible. who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. And we don't have time to dig into this. And in fact, I would love to expand this, and I have expanded this to include all the elements. It becomes quite fascinating. The first thing to take away is there's a lot more responsibility for the asset owners to control supply chain attacks than is usually implied. The software masquerading, again, being a good example. You can't really blame the supplier if you're using cracked software, or if your teams are using cracked software. It's your responsibility to be able to look after. So particularly on distribution, there's a lot of things that the software user, the asset owner, can do to reduce and to manage supply chain attacks. But not everything. There are some things where the most important thing for the asset owner is to be informed. And again, that goes back to we need transparency. I don't have time to dig through that whole RISI chart, and I definitely don't have time to go through all the ways that I think we should be able to mitigate all those attacks. But I do think, and I hope the one thing you guys take away from this is that I think it's essential that we develop a complete definition and a complete software supply chain attack taxonomy that goes across the industry and includes all forms of attacks, not just ones that are very specific and focused, say, against open source. It just makes no sense to define a set of supply chain solutions on, say, open source software when, to protect against issues with, say, OpenSSL, when the same PLC will contain a proprietary software bundle, say, Code Assist, and OpenSSL, Code Assist are both in the same box. You don't want two separate controls. So I think it's very important that we have a complete taxonomy, and this is my proposal for that taxonomy. The second thing is that I think the taxonomy shows that asset owners have a lot more responsibilities than have typically been stated in most supply chain guidelines, particularly anything to do with the distribution leg. Sometimes they have full responsibility, sometimes they have considerable responsibility, like checking those certs, making sure that the certificates and software are being signed by legitimate companies and not some little fake company that's masquerading, looking like it's Microsoft or looking like it's a legitimate company. When it comes to software creation-focused attacks, I think that the responsibility largely falls to the people who create the software to make sure the bad guys aren't in their software development processes. But not all of it. The real responsibility is transmitting that information up. And if you came to Cassie's talk earlier about how important it is, she talked about the amount of information, and it's really important to be able to share that information up to the asset owners. So the asset owners can start tracking two things. Where did that software come from? Yes, I bought it from so-and-so, but where are all the components? And then what are those suppliers? What's the risks of those third parties? Are they good corporate citizens? Are they risky? Is that open source project only got one maintainer, and if he gets hit by a bus, that whole open source project collapses? Or is that open source project largely got maintainers who have a full-time day job working for a national security agent in a hostile nation? This is the type of thing I think we need to know, and we need to communicate up and down the supply chain. Where did our software come from, and what is the trustworthiness of those suppliers? Then, as asset owners, we need to start tying that information to our asset databases so that when some sort of Log4j, some sort of SolarWinds disaster occurs, we can respond quickly. And so this really is the need to be able to have that information and be able to prioritize assets, prioritize high-risk third parties by impact, by mitigation strategy, and do that before the events occur, not after. Thank you very much, and welcome any comments, suggestions. Again, this is a work in progress. Really hope to hear from you on how this could be fine-tuned and really made into a full definition. Thank you again.